Hi friends, I hope you're all well. Today I'm going to be talking to you about all the books that I read in the month of April. I will be honest, I was kind of toying with the idea of doing just like a favourites video of my favourite books of the month, but then I thought that it would be fun to have a record of all the books I had read. The reason that I thought I might do just a favourites video is because there's a few of these books I don't have a lot to say about, and so I'll mention them briefly and talk about my thoughts, but I do like to kind of go into depth about books, and that's kind of what I usually do in my wrap-ups. But with that said, here's my April wrap-up. So the first book I read was The Art of White Roses by Viviana, Prado, Nunes, and this is a hard-hitting YA set in 1950s Cuba. It was very interesting to see a kind of historical fiction novel like aimed at a YA audience. I would say it was quite hard-hitting. There's quite a lot of content warnings for this book, and I think it's quite ambitious, and I would say that the ambition was kind of the novel's downfall, if I'm honest. There's a lot of characters, a lot of themes introduced, but I felt like it was a little bit too much for the size of the novel. It's only 180 pages, and it just felt a little bit too much crammed in kind of situation. But saying that, I would definitely read more from this author, and I'm very curious to see what else they'll go on to write. I then listened to a short story by John Chu, and it was called The Water That Falls on You From Nowhere, and this is a sci-fi short fiction piece based on the idea that when you lie, water falls on you, like a big shoot of water will fall on someone if they lie. And so it was quite interesting because it was kind of exploring themes of sexuality and having to hide your sexuality from family, and kind of the coming out kind of experience. And it was very interesting. It had a lot of interesting themes about familial ties, sexuality, secrecy and things like that. But I just felt like I wish I had read it rather than listened to it. I think the format didn't do it justice. And I also felt like because there was quite a lot of what you might call world building to happen, this would have been more suited to like a novella or full novel format, and it just felt a little bit underdeveloped to me. I then read Almost Adults by Ali Pantony, and this is a contemporary novel set in London. It follows a group of 4 friends, and it is quite a lot of fun. It was quite light-hearted, surprisingly emotional, but I did really like it in a lot of ways. It wasn't my favourite contemporary that I read this month. I did read quite a fair few contemporaries, but I still think it's good, and I would especially recommend it for reluctant readers and people who like reading magazines and are trying to kind of branch into fiction and kind of novel reading, because I think that the writer's writing style is very readable, it's very engaging, and it does read like a magazine. My only real critique of this book is that I felt like some of the characters were a little bit underdeveloped compared to other ones, so it was a kind of a imbalance in terms of the characters, and we got each of their points of view, which I really liked, but some of them were given a little bit more weight, a little bit more storyline, and obviously as a reader then you connect more with some of them over others, but it was still a really interesting and fun read, and I did get surprisingly engaged with it and wrapped up in the storyline. So yeah, definitely one that is good if you're in the market for a contemporary. I then was really craving a graphic novel, and I picked up Witchy by Ariel, Slamet, Ries, and this is a really fun kind of fantasy LGBT kind of story. It follows a young girl, and in the world the power and your power as an individual is based on your hair, so the length of your hair, but there is such a thing as having too long hair and your hair becoming too powerful. And so your magic strength and your strength and kind of position in this world is based on your hair, which was a really interesting concept, and I really liked that as a concept. I also just overall really loved the characters and the story, and I found myself getting totally swept up in it. I think at the time I read it I was feeling quite stressed and a little bit kind of overwhelmed with a lot of things that were going on, and it was just nice to kind of get lost in this graphic novel. And I'd been really struggling to sleep, that's what it was. I remember just as I was finishing this, I fell asleep. So that kind of made me feel really relaxed, really content, and it was just a really nice reading experience. The art as well is very like cool. I really liked the art style. It's quite bright and bold and quite fun, but also has like quite a lot of detail in it. So yeah, I definitely really liked it. Pick this one up if you're in the market for a graphic novel that's about coming of age, belonging, identity, finding your voice, and also kind of repression or living in fear based on things which are out with your control. It was quite a lot of complex themes in this, but kind of explored in a very light way, very accessible way, and yeah, just overall I really enjoyed this one. I then was in the market for another graphic novel, and I was looking for something sweet and light and fluffy because I had enjoyed Witchy so much, and I picked up Cheer Up, Love and Pom-Poms, and that's by Crystal Fraser, and I got this on NetGalley. I picked it up as like a read now title. This is a very sweet, queer, YA romance graphic novel. It follows a friends to lovers kind of storyline, and a lot of that kind of romance storyline I really enjoyed following. There is a wider storyline about the kind of school setting, about cheerleading, about transphobia, and things like that fall in with that category. And I will definitely give a content warning for graphic and repeated transphobia in the storyline, directed at one of the characters. I did feel like that particular character couldn't really catch a break, and sometimes I felt like the transphobia was kind of overly repeated, and the poor guy, I just felt so sorry for the poor character that they just couldn't get a break from transphobia. And I guess that does reflect quite a lot of people's experiences, especially growing up in a school setting. But it's definitely something that could be really hard to read, so do approach with caution. I then read The Split by Laura Kay, which might have been my favourite read of the entire month. I just had such a good time reading this book. It follows a young woman who had just broken up with her girlfriend. She's been dumped, and she returns from London to Sheffield to live with her dad and kind of regroup. And there she reconnects with an old friend, and that friend is seeking the affection of a male, and in trying to kind of get his attention, get his affection, he decides that he's going to embark on a challenge to kind of really draw his attention. And so they set out to run 10k together at this local kind of sports event, and it follows them training, and in the midst of that they join a running group, and it's about the running group and the people they meet. And so it's kind of, there is a romance plot line going on here, but a lot of it's about the friendships and the kind of rebuilding of your life following a relationship breakup. I just really loved this. I came across it because of Jen at Jen the Librarian, and I'll link their channel down below, but I just thought it was absolutely fab. It was 99p on Kindle when I read it, so it might still be on a Kindle deal if you're lucky. It also has mixed media, which I really like, and I just overall just felt like our main character, Ali, was just like somebody who I would be friends with. I just had such a good time kind of spending time with this character. I also felt like the book really influenced my day-to-day life. So there's like little scenes where they're having tea and brownies, and I was like, oh, I really want tea and brownies. They had a curry one night, and I was like, oh, I'm going to make a curry. And with the running, it actually encouraged me to get back into running. So if you are a booktuber and you're ever thinking of doing one of these, you know, a book controls my weekend or whatever, definitely choose this book because you will be heavily influenced whether you like it or not. So pick this book up if you're looking for a laugh out loud, feel good, romance, romantic comedy kind of novel with absolutely brilliant descriptions of food. I then finished listening to the audiobook of Odd Girl Out by Laura James, and this is a memoir that I mentioned in my Books by Autistic Writers recommendation video. This one featured in the part of the video where I talk about books on my TBR that I'm excited to read, and I think talking about them in that video made me pick them up because I actually ended up picking up 3 of the books that were on the list, so yeah. And for this I think the audiobook was a really good option. I listened to the audiobook and it's narrated by somebody called Louisa Patikas, and they just did such a fabulous job. I actually didn't realise that it wasn't the author narrating it because it just felt very authentic, very kind of real, and as if the author were speaking to us. So I really enjoyed that. And in many ways this is a memoir that I think is worth reading. It follows the author's journey and kind of discovering their diagnosis of autism, and kind of following that journey as they find ways of coping. They kind of rediscover things about themselves. They find out that things that they just thought were things that everyone was experiencing actually is something related to autism. All of that was very interesting, and I found this idea of like finally having a label to help you make sense of things like really quite a healthy journey that the author was going on in many ways. And ultimately it was really nice to see her find healthier coping mechanisms and kind of accept herself, so that was a very kind of fulfilling I guess storyline, although memoirs are a different kind of breed of book. But I will say that I did find the structure a little bit confusing. It is a non-linear structure that the book follows, and sometimes it kind of jumped in and out of time frames, which I just struggled to follow. And occasionally I did find the writer was kind of repeating ideas and repeating themselves and what they were kind of talking about. And it just felt like maybe a little bit of a tighter edit might have kind of cleared that up. And that's kind of, I suppose, me putting my editorial hat on, which does sometimes happen when I read books. But I did think it was still a memoir worth reading, and I'm really glad that I picked it up. I then read another favourite from the month, and that was The Kiss Quotient by Helen Hoang. And I really enjoyed this one. It's quite a sweet, fun, sexy romance novel. We follow our main character, Stella, who is trying to kind of work out sex in relationships. She's trying to work out how she can navigate that, how to behave in sexual situations, and how to get enjoyment out of sex. And so she hires an escort to help her kind of build this confidence, she sees it as like experience. If she can kind of experience this and learn how to do it, that she will be okay in other relationships. And I love the kind of first, I would say like 70% of this is very kind of slow paced and kind of day by day following these people's experiences, and I thought it was just really beautiful. I love the way Helen Hoang talks about consent and writes consent into the fiction that she writes. I think it's really well done. But for me, there's a bit of a change of pace about the kind of 20 to 30%, that final part of the book, and it takes a kind of faster pace, and it does kind of feel a little bit rushed to me personally. That is probably the only thing that I would just sort of say about this book that's not completely positive, because I had such a good time reading this book and really would recommend it. I cannot wait for Helen Hoang's third book to come out in this series, and I will now read anything that Helen Hoang writes, to be honest. I then read two books I don't have a whole lot to say about. So the first one is Comic Studies of the Modern Icelander, which is just like single page illustrations, and the second one is Stranger Planet, which is like single page comic strips, I guess. There's more of a storyline in the pages, but there's not an overarching storyline of the book. I am glad I read both, and I did get quite a few laughs out of Stranger Planet. I then read Somewhere Among, and that's by Annie Donwerth-Chikamatsu, and this is a novel in verse which follows a young girl who has Japanese heritage, and she goes to visit her Japanese grandparents with her parents, but she has grown up in the United States, so she's kind of experiencing this between cultures experience, a bit of culture shock about some of the things to do with the Japanese side of the family, and I think just as a young person kind of missing her friends back in America, thinking about her grandparents back in America, and kind of longing for both worlds to connect. And I like the way the author explored that kind of idea of being stuck between two cultures and kind of struggling and wrestling with that and wanting to be both places at once with all the people that you love all the time and just not being able to have that. I especially love the main character's relationships with her Japanese grandparents and the kind of experiences there. I felt like that was the most fleshed out relationship in the book, and I just overall thought it was really sweet and lovely and wholesome. I will say that sometimes with this book I felt like some of the experiences that the main characters were experiencing were more coming from like the author's voice rather than necessarily our character's voice, and I did feel like the character was a little bit underdeveloped, and I was struggling to kind of connect with her and experience everything in the way that I hoped that I would, if that makes sense. So I felt like I was kind of detached from the narrative, but it was still really good read, and I would definitely recommend it if you're looking for a novel in verse book, or if you are also interested in like cultural differences, being between cultures, etc, etc. I then read COSMOKNIGHTS by Hannah Templer, and this is set in a world where people fight for the hands of princesses essentially, and they go into an actual physical battle in order to win the hand of somebody who's of, you know, prestige, I guess. And it was really quite a fun read, and I loved the rebellious themes and the kind of idea of like tearing down the patriarchy and just being overall pretty badass. I just thought the characters were absolutely brilliant. Some real kind of laugh out loud moments. I just had a good time reading this graphic novel. The art style as well is absolutely stunning. Like, it's bright, it's kind of pinky purples often, but it's just very, very pretty. and I would definitely recommend it. This is supposed to be the first issue in a series, and so I'm really hoping that the series has continued and I get to read more from this world and from these characters. But if you like sci-fi, you like graphic novels, and you like themes, LGBT themes, rebellious themes, feminist themes, anything like that, I think you will like this one. I then read ONIBI, Diary of a Yokai Ghost Hunter, and that's by Atelier, Sentō, and this was like quite good. It's like a series of it's based on this author who's actually a couple. It's based on their experiences traveling in Japan, and it follows kind of surreal, almost like paranormal experiences that they had, and it's also kind of steeped in Japanese folklore and mythology. The art style wasn't necessarily my favourite, like it's a little bit different than what I might typically go for in a graphic novel, but I found the stories really eerie, really atmospheric, and I did really enjoy it. I'm definitely somebody who is faint-hearted, and I found myself royally spooked by this book, so it might not be spooky to you if you're not so faint-hearted, but it was still a good time. I'm glad I read it, and it was very interesting in terms of like Japanese folklore and things like that as well. And the final book I read was The Proposal by Jasmine, and this is a romance novel that begins with a protagonist who is proposed to at a game. I think it's a baseball game that she's proposed to at, and somebody behind her, a brother and sister, end up saving her from the occasion and from the kind of backlash that she experiences when she says no. And it follows the relationships between our main protagonist and the brother and sister, in particular the brother, and the kind of romance that develops there. This is actually the final book in the Wedding Date series that I have yet to read, if that makes sense. So it was the last one I still had to read, and I'm glad I finished off the series. The only one I didn't finish was the Royals, I think, or something about royals. I just don't really like this kind of trend of like romanticising royals in fiction. But The Proposal was good fun. It kind of follows basically Jasmine Guillory's like similar format. I think because I've read them all now, I kind of know her format with fiction and how she kind of builds these characters out, and the storylines and things like that. So if you like Jasmine Guillory, you'll probably like this one. The way I would describe Jasmine Guillory's novels and the kind of format, I guess, that I'm talking about is that there's always two older protagonists. They always kind of hit it off, and there's a lot of food eating, there's some sex scenes on page, and then there's often a kind of push and pull in terms of commitment, and then, you know, we end happily. So while I like that in many ways, I think maybe reading them all so closely together, I think I first started in 2019, and then I've kind of read them all over the last 2 years, and I think that's maybe just a little bit too intense to read them all back to back like that. If you're looking for recommendations from this series, my favourites have been The Wedding Date. I would say that was definitely my favourite. It's the first one I read, which might be partly why it's my favourite, because the kind of format was then set. And then in position 2, I would say Party of Two, because I felt like there was quite a lot of interesting themes explored in terms of the main character's work life, and the kind of complications of that. But yeah, I had a really good reading month. I definitely sought out joy in what I was reading. I was trying to look for lighter themes. I think there was only 1 or 2 books that I read that were a little bit heavier, but overall I was kind of seeking joy, escapism, and that's kind of what I was hoping for in my book. My favourites of the month this month, definitely The Split by Laura Kay. That was just like peak feel-good rom-com kind of feelings. I also loved The Kiss Quotient by Helen Hoang. This was another feel-good romantic, I wouldn't say it was romantic comedy, but a romance novel. And for graphic novels, I would definitely say Witchy and COSMOKNIGHTS were 2 that are definitely worth reading and were just a good time, good fun, and I would highly recommend all 4 of those books. So let me know if you've read any of these books, what you thought of them, and if you enjoyed them like I did, or if you had different thoughts to me. I'd love to chat to you in the comments below. But that's all for this wrap up, so thank you so much for watching, and I will see you again next time.